So without any further ado, I'd like to re-invite back up to the stage Professor Maggie Walter, who is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Aboriginal Research and Leadership, and she's also the Professor of Sociology at the University of Tasmania. She teaches and publishes in the fields of race relations, inequality and research methods and methodologies. Could you please join me now in welcoming again Professor Maggie Walters.
Ya Palingana. That's welcome in Palawakani. So first of all, of course, I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and very glad to be back on this country speaking again. Bring those down to my height. And thank you, Uncle Ray, this morning for that wonderful welcome to country. So what I'm going to do today is talk about data, and I want to take up something that was said before about the data, that there are other ways of other knowledges, other ways of collecting information, and that's very true. So I don't want to make any claim that resetting data is the whole problem, or that resetting it is going to be the whole solution. It's just a small part, but it's an important part, and it's the bit I know. So that's just concentrate on that. One of the key reasons why we need to talk about data is that data paradox I talked about this morning. So we've got to remember that statistics are not neutral. So it doesn't matter what sort of statistics they are, they're not neutral, but Indigenous statistics in particular are not neutral. And so they also are very powerful persuaders. And I think we need to remember when we think about data that it may, like data in numeric form, it's just a way of summarising information into a numeric form. White people love a statistic. And so you can make a very powerful argument if you've got statistics and the right statistics at your fingertips. But the way that it is currently construed, statistics or Indigenous data, numeric data, is nearly totally an Indigenous free zone in Australia. So we need to be there. So this is what we've got. So we've got this data desert of the sort of knowledge, the data we want to have. We've got this huge amount of data from administrative data collections, ABS, that is reflected in all of these things here. Which questions are asked, why they're asked, how they're asked, who's doing the asking, and how the data are interpreted and by whom. And that's the big one. Somebody was recently telling me that they were in a statistics agency, which will remain nameless, and they'd seen from the data that the biggest group of Aboriginal people in higher education were women over 40. So this person, being an Aboriginal person, thought, these are women who have got, are past the major parts of bringing up their littlies and are now wanting to have an opportunity to get the education they didn't have beforehand. So they were gobsmacked when the people who were doing the interpretation, these are senior public service and policymakers, said that they thought that the reason was because people got extra money on Centrelink if they went back to uni. So this is the sort of realm that we're dealing with. When the racialised assumptions and stereotypes about Aboriginal people have infiltrated people's assumptions when they look at the data. So it's not just what the data figures say, it's how it's interpreted. So this is how I see current data. I love an acronym. So the BADA data is what we've currently got. And we should be afraid and very afraid, because data matters and it's going to matter a whole lot more. So at the moment we have the huge big data downput from the ABS. We've got the linked data that's now from the ABS. We're having administrative data collections which have all sorts of problems in their own rights, now being all linked up, with somehow the belief system that if you put enough of these data sets together, a magic answer will pop out. And it won't, because the presumption is that you've got this big ball of data. But you haven't. You've just got this extremely long string of the same data. You're not going to get any different answers, and the answers you're going to get are all going to be prejudicial. So blameworthy, aggregate, decontextualised, deficit and reductive. So these are all just things I've picked up from different reports. So alcohol and drug related problems, comparing Aboriginal with non-Aboriginal people. So you can see that I'm always intrigued by the racial naming there. We're compared to the people whose race is not named, but they're named by the race they are not. So it's about implying that somehow we are to blame for that our undeservingness is linked to our inequality. And so, okay, I mean, you might have the figures that says that Aboriginal people are more likely to have alcohol and drug-related problems, but these sorts of tables do not produce themselves. They're produced by people, and people make the decision that this is the sort of data that they want to appear in the whatever report they're writing. So out of all the data points that they could look at, this is what they choose. And you see how simplistic it is as well. So we've divided it by race and we've divided it by age group. Always presented very simplistically. Then we've got the aggregate data. I mean, how useless is this? These sorts of reports come up all the time, comparing the Indigenous with the non-Indigenous right across. This is what Aboriginal Australia looks like. Now, this is my mob down here. These data are no good to us. They're no good to policymakers. They're just presenting a picture, and I don't know why they keep going with them. They're useless for policy purposes. We need data that is at community level, at its nation level. We can't get it. It doesn't exist. And it's 5D. Talked about this bit this morning. This is about constantly positioning us and all the data portrayals of us around deficit, about disadvantage, about difference, about disparity, and about our dysfunction. And it gets repeated again and again and again. And this is how we are seen and how we see ourselves. Again, that really simplistic by state. You know, what does that tell you? I don't know. Gee. And I understand this stuff. It's decontextualised. It's always taken away from the context in which it is produced. So you just look at one little data point, like smoking rates. Well, smoking rates don't happen by themselves. They happen in a life world in which we live in. So people smoke for a whole lot of reasons. And there's a whole lot of information on this. You know, Michael Marmot, who did the sort of Whitehall studies, has talked about this, about smoking linking to people feeling that they don't have control of their own lives. But we just get this simplistic stuff. So it's always about describing. We have this relentless trope of deficit data, simplistically positioned, dichotomously positioned, us versus the normal not us. No discussion of why. And that's the important discussion. And we're reductive. So if you have seen the number of times I've had to go home and have a martini because I've been arguing with non-Indigenous data people, researchers, that you can't just plug Indigenous, non-Indigenous into your big model as just a dichotomous variable. If you do that, all you're doing is just reducing and saying everything there is related to Aboriginality. Well, it might be, but it's related about what it means to be an Aboriginal person in this country in this time, not of who we are by race. So if you do that, you guarantee that you will get a deficit result. And so far it's working really well. So we've got this sort of, this clash of values that we were talking about this morning, about the data that we want and the data that we've got and the data that they want. So it's all about what government wants to know about us. And you wonder why they just want to keep knowing the same things again and again. So we want data that informs a comprehensive, nuanced narrative of who we are as peoples, of our cultures, our communities, our resilience, our goals and our successes. We get blaming data. We need data that recognises our cultural and geographical diversity to provide evidence for community-level planning, nation building and service delivery. We get aggregate data. We need data that is inclusive of the wider social structural context complexities in which Aboriginal disadvantage and all the other things in our lives actually occurs. We get decontextualised data that is completely outside. It focuses in on the individual, doesn't even look at families. We need data that prioritises our agendas and moves past measures of problems. That's what we get. And we need data that are both accessible and amenable to our requirements. So the thing with data at the moment seems that the project mostly is about collecting data. The analysis, so NatSys, how can you access it? Anybody accessed any NatSys data? It was collected 2016. To go in, to get any NatSys data, I have to go into an ABS office, I have to sign in, I have to have an ABS officer standing by me while I look at their one terminal, and then I can put in a little bit of analysis. It will then go and somebody else will look at it and decide if that's something that I can ask of the data, and then maybe 3 hours later I'll get a little bit of output. Well, that's not very useful, but yet all of our people, how many people were asked had to participate in NatSys, and we can't even access our own data. Okay, so why does it look like this? So the realities of data indicators, the socio-cultural political realities of data indicators determine what data perceived as necessary, for what purpose and why they're important. And it is not us making those decisions. We're not even being asked. Who controls the process? So that cultural framework determines the data collection, design and process, the analysis process, what results are produced, and more importantly, how those results are interpreted. And that's the content. Who determines the content? Again, it's not us. So they reflect the values and priorities of those who control the data and the process and the social cultural framework in which that process is embedded. So given how the data are produced, or the context of them, it's no wonder that they look like they do. So what do? This has real life consequences for us. Okay. Oh, go back one. No, too late, I can't work the back button. Let's talk about Indigenous data sovereignty. So this is a growing, rapidly growing global movement where Indigenous peoples from the US, from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, now increasingly Mexico, the Sami people from the Nordic Scandinavian countries are coming together and saying, okay, these are our data. We have a right to these data. So it is our right to govern the collection, ownership and application of our own data. And it derives from our inherent rights to govern, from our traditional roles and responsibilities. It should be positioned within the human rights. So if you have a look at UNDRIP, there's probably about 8 or 9 different clauses relate directly to data and our right to data. And it's about our knowledges. They belong to us, and we have a right to that decision making. So in New Zealand, Aotearoa, there's been some big changes. Everything's not perfect there, but this week on Wednesday in Canberra, we ran an Indigenous Data Sovereignty Summit, and we had 4 of our colleagues from the Te Mano Rawanga workshop come across from the network. And we had more than 40 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attend. And in that workshop, we set out and actually framed up the key protocols which we think that our data need to be applied to anybody who is using or accessing or even creating our data. We need to step up, and we need to be the people. We can't wait, because if we wait and we ask, we get this much, and it acts like it's this much. So we need to step up, and we need to say, this is our data and this is how we want it. And so I wasn't kidding this morning when I said to everybody, don't go any more advisory groups. Don't go any more reference groups. If a research project does not have Indigenous researchers, then a reference group is not going to fix it. Perhaps it shouldn't be done, or perhaps it should have Indigenous researchers who are guiding the process. It's about leadership. Okay. So we've got these twin things. We've got this, what I call the data of disregard. So we need to end the dominance of those sort of data. But then we need to have data for governance, and that's the data required by us for all of our aspirations, all of our needs, and to support nation building as defined by us. These are the data we need, and we're not getting them. And I have said to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and I love the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there's some wonderful people work there, But we are a level of government, and it is their role to be supporting our data needs. And at the moment, they're not. And so its governance is the mechanism by which Indigenous data sovereignty is achieved. So it's a concept, it's nebulous, but governance, we can decide what that looks like and we can determine it. Okay. So governance of the data allows us to refute the data of disregard, and it allows us to tell our own stories through data of who we are and how we should be known to ourselves and to others. And data for governance, it's about being able to design and deliver and organise our own projects based on the data we need. You can't do anything without data. Data is just a core basic need at all sorts of levels. We really need to develop our technical and human resource capacities, and that's my dream, is to be able to really raise the level of statistical literacy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and really raise the number. I've got 4 going at the moment, but I'd like to make it 100 of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are at ease with quantitative data. And I have to tell you, it's not that hard. It really isn't. You dress it up with all sorts of language. It's quite simple. And we need to reduce the number of indicators to fewer but more meaningful indicators, indicators that are useful for us, indicators that we design and that we make the decisions about. Oops, get my clock going again. Okay. So this is what governance at one sort of basic level looks like. It's leadership on what data and when, how and why those data are gathered and analysed. So don't just automatically reach for a certain data thing. Talk to us. We'll tell you what data is needed at the community level, at the national level and all sorts of levels in between. We need to have some sort of decision making on how existing data sets are being used and who has access to them. Just because you can run a multivariate model does not mean you can actually interpret the data. We see that again and again. We need that capacity to allow us, and we also need about Indigenous data storage. What about all the data that's out there? Where do people safely store that so they can keep it and it's kept safe for the people who own it? And we need those protocols, and that's what we're working on right now. So if you want to know more about Indigenous data sovereignty, can I suggest that you download this book, which is available for free, downloadable from ANU Press. And watch out on Monday when we'll be sending our communique out that we came through with the Data Sovereignty Workshop or the Summit on Wednesday, and we'll be trying to move it there. And anybody who wants to be involved, so I'm part of the Mayam Nairi Wingara Australian Indigenous Data Collective. If you want to be involved, watch for the communique and just let us know. It's not a closed shop by any means. It's fully open. We want you there. So thank you very much.